Before we work on more of these routes here, let's actually restructure our routes file a little bit. It's already getting a bit bigger, still okay, but getting bigger. And the more routes we add, and with all the logic that needs to execute for every route, the bigger this file will get. Therefore, it's a good idea to follow this MVC structure, which stands for Model View Controller. Now, we won't have a view here. That is what the user would see. We're building a REST API, so there is no page, no HTML file we would render on the server, which we show to the user. But we have models, like the error blueprint here, and we will have controllers. Well, we don't have them yet, but controllers will be files that hold the actual logic that should execute when a certain route is reached. So they glue together the incoming request and then our models and the logic that should run for such an incoming request. Hence here, I'll create a new folder, controllers, and in there, I will add a places-controller.js file. Again, you could just name it places because it already is a controllers folder. But to make it really clear, also if I have the file open like this, you can quickly see it here at the top, what's in the file, I will name it like this so that this is always clearly visible what's in there. So we'll have a places controller and later also a users controller file. So I'll already create both. And the idea is that in the places controller, we have all the middleware functions which actually are reached for certain routes. So for example, here, for this first route here, for a specific place ID, I would cut this function from places routes and move it to the places controller. There I will add it as a new function, and it's up to you which kind of function you create, if you use a function declaration or a function expression. Here I'll go for a function expression with an arrow function, and I will name it getPlaceById and paste in my function. Now, as I mentioned, alternatives would be to create a function getPlaceById and then have your logic there, or getPlaceById and use the expression style, but not use an arrow function, but use the function keyword. These would be alternatives. I'll go for the arrow function here. So now we have getPlaceById. I also have another function, of course. So I'll cut this as well from my routes file and add it here in the controller. And this file, of course, will now get a bit bigger, but it's clearly focused on only middleware functions. And that's the whole idea. We want to have focused files. We want to have a file which is all about routing and mapping paths and HTTP methods to controllers. And then we want to have controllers which are all about having these middleware functions and the logic. So it's okay if that file gets a bit bigger. We can always go into this file if we want to look for the logic, and go into this file if we want to look for the mapping and the paths we're using, and we're not mixing both in one super huge file. That's the idea. So in the places controller, we can now add that other function getPlaceByUserId, paste in that function here, and now important, also move the dummy places from the routes file to the places controller file, because that is where we interact with the dummy places. That's of course therefore where we should have that array. Now this is all nice. We don't need to import Express here, by the way, because I'm not using any feature from Express here. I'm just setting up some regular functions which receive everything they need as parameters. But we need to export our functions here so that we can link them to the routes which are registered in a different file. Side note, we also need to import the HTTP error model here in the places controller though, because I'm using it in there. But now I want to export the getPlaceById and the getPlaceByUserId function. Now we learned that we can export by using module.exports. This allows us to export a single thing, but here I have multiple things. For that, Node also has an alternative export syntax. Instead of module.exports, you can use exports dot any name of your choice, but here I like to repeat my function names, so getPlaceById, for example. and set this equal to the thing you want to export under that name. So in this case, I'll point at getPlaceById. Important, I don't execute it. Express will execute it when a request is incoming. I just want to export a pointer to that function so that Express is able to know what to execute for an incoming request. And I'll therefore do the same for getPlaceByUserId here. Now both will be bundled in one object, which now has these properties which hold the pointers to these functions as values. So now in places routes, we can import our controllers. Our places controllers can be found with require by going out of the routes folder, into the controllers folder, into places controllers. And then here for router get place ID, I can point at places controllers get place by ID. Again, I'll not execute it here. I'll just point at it so that Express has a pointer at the function it should execute for us when a request reaches this route. And we can do the same thing here for this route. And now we have a pointer at this function for this route and a pointer at this function for this route. The result is that it should work as before. Let's try both the error and the success cases. Yep, that is looking good. But the difference is that we now have a clean routes file where we can quickly see our paths and methods and which controller function is responsible for it. And then our controller file, which is a bit longer, but which itself then is also clearly focused on just defining our middleware functions.